The moment we stepped into the Marwood estate, I felt that strange stillness beneath the polished glamour. The scent of clove-studded oranges and white pine clung to the air like perfume, and a string quartet played softly from the music room. Everything gleamed. Everything was perfect, except for the knot tightening in my stomach. The living room was a picture from a luxury catalog, cream silk curtains, marble fireplace garlands of gold and silver threading every banister, and under the towering tree 12 feet tall, no doubt imported from Vermont, sat a mountain of presents. Thick wrapping paper matching ribbon gold wax seals on every card. A showcase of control, tradition, power. Each gift had a name, a calligraphed tag in looping script placed carefully under each child's designated chair. Emma, Lachlan, Isabel. Even the McKinley boy from next door, barely a year old, had his own stack beside a stuffed polar bear. I moved closer, scanning the arrangement. My eyes flicked from chair to chair, each velvet cushion holding a curated pile of wrapped promises. But there was no Asher, no red ribbon, no cream envelope, no handmade ornament on the tree with his name, not even a stocking. My throat tightened. I turned toward Ethan, expecting him to react, frown, stiffen, anything, but he stood calmly beside me, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly on Asher's shoulder. And he didn't look surprised. Asher looked up at me, his hazel eyes wide, unsure. He was wearing the gray sweater I'd knitted last year, the sleeves finally just right. His hair was combed back, his shoes polished so carefully that morning. He didn't say a word. Just walked quietly to the empty velvet chair in the corner. His chair, though no one had labeled it as such, and folded his hands in his lap. Ethan followed him with his eyes, then looked at me and gave a small nod. Not reassurance exactly, more like a signal, as if something had already been set in motion and all I had to do was wait. So I sat down beside my son and placed my hand over his. Ethan didn't sit. He kept his posture upright, almost expectant. The gift exchange began with ceremony as always. Vivian stood by the fireplace, champagne flute in hand, commanding the attention of the room with her melodic voice and signature self-satisfaction. "We'll go youngest to oldest," she announced, like it was a royal decree. Each child was summoned like nobility. Emma received a pair of gold earrings and ballet lessons with a dancer flown in from Prague. Lachlan opened his monogrammed skis, then a watch that cost more than my car. Isabel's pile was wrapped in iridescent tulle and designer logos. Even baby McKinley, still in diapers, was wheeled forward in a sleigh-shaped stroller to receive a custom-built cedar playhouse. Asher sat perfectly still. His hands remained folded, though I saw the way his fingers twitched. He didn't look around the room anymore. He stared straight ahead, his expression blank but braced. I wanted to stand, to speak, to tear every gold-wrapped box apart until someone acknowledged my son. But just as the silence surrounding Asher grew unbearable, Ethan moved. He rose slowly, ignoring the murmured voices, the puzzled glances. Without a word, he walked across the room and crouched beside Asher. From his inner jacket pocket, he pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope, sealed with a wax stamp I didn't recognize. "This is for you," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "From your mom and me." Asher took it carefully, his hands trembling slightly. He looked up at Ethan, then at me. I nodded. He broke the seal and pulled out the documents inside. I recognized them before he did legal papers notarized and stamped. I caught the words property deed and transfer of ownership in Addison Hollow estate. Ethan turned to face the room, his voice calm and measured. "That property has been in my family for 3 generations. Today, it belongs to my son." Every sound in the room seemed to vanish. No rustling paper, no clinking glasses, just the weight of those words pressing into the walls of this perfect, polished house. Vivian's smile faltered for the first time in a decade, and I knew with certainty that Ethan wasn't done. It didn't start this way. Or maybe it did, and I just chose not to see it. The first Christmas after Ethan and I married, I remember standing in the same room newly minted as a Marwood, trying not to fidget in a dress I'd bought on sale, and spent hours altering myself. Vivian had greeted me with a kiss that landed in the air beside my cheek, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're refreshing," she'd said, as though I were a sorbet between richer courses. Harris hadn't said much at all, just offered me a firm handshake and moved on. I spent the next 10 years convincing myself it wasn't personal, that they were just formal. Old money was like that, I told myself. It had codes I hadn't learned yet, rhythms I wasn't raised with. I thought I could catch up, learn the choreography if I listened hard enough. So I smiled. I baked bread from scratch for their brunches. I offered to help with their charity auctions. I laughed at the appropriate moments even when the joke was at my expense. And every year at Christmas, I bought more carefully chosen gifts. I wrapped them in their preferred gold and cream palette. I studied the family tree so I wouldn't forget a name. I corrected my posture in pictures. I tried. God, I tried, but watching Asher sit through that parade of curated adoration without so much as a stocking, I understood something I should have known years ago. They never planned to let us in. Not really. Vivian didn't want a daughter-in-law. She wanted a mirror, someone to reflect her elegance back to her, to fit within the clean lines of her curated world. I had my own shape. I didn't fit. And now neither did my son. I turned to look at Ethan, who stood tall, unshaken. There was a resolve in him I hadn't seen before. Not just quiet disappointment, but clarity. Maybe this wasn't just my battle after all. Maybe it never had been. I slipped away from the living room once the adults began murmuring again, their discomfort trying to smooth itself back into polite conversation. I needed air, or maybe I just needed distance. Something inside me was splintering, and I wasn't sure if I could hold it in much longer. The kitchen was, of course, pristine. Not a smudge on the marble counters, not a crumb on the gleaming floors. A uniformed caterer moved silently near the pantry. I smiled briefly, nodded, then spotted it something near the trash bin behind a stack of empty ribbon boxes and discarded wrapping. I knew it before I even touched it. The edges of the paper were slightly curled. The wrapping Asher's own hand-cut stars taped lovingly around it was torn but still hanging on. I pulled it out gently, holding it in both hands. His drawing. He'd spent hours on it. A watercolor portrait of Vivian and Harris in their garden, based on a photo he'd found in one of their hallway frames. I remembered him smoothing the paper before school, whispering, "Maybe this year she'll put mine up with the others." And now it sat here, crumpled, forgotten, beside a trash can. My fingers clenched around the edge of the paper hard enough to bend it. I found Ethan leaning against the wall just outside the kitchen, watching the flickering lights on the stair garland, like they might offer him guidance. I didn't say a word, just held the painting out to him. He looked down at it, then back at me. Something hardened in his expression. "She threw it out," I said quietly. "She didn't even pretend." Ethan nodded once. "That's the last time he'll ever feel like a ghost in this family." I stared at him, something unspoken passing between us. Not anger, not even sorrow anymore. Just the shared recognition that something had shifted and it wasn't going back. He didn't ask me to let it go. He didn't offer excuses. Instead, he reached into his jacket again and pulled out a second envelope. I followed Ethan to the den, the envelope still tucked in his hand. He shut the door behind us and walked to the small desk near the window. It wasn't one of Harris's grand studies or Vivian's ornate parlor desks. Just a simple dark walnut table one Ethan used when we visited during the holidays, more out of necessity than comfort. He opened the drawer and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges and creased from being handled too many times. He handed it to me without a word. I unfolded it slowly. It was addressed to his parents. Not typed, but written in Ethan's clean, deliberate handwriting, the kind he used when something mattered. He didn't look at me as I read. It wasn't angry, but it cut sharper because of that. He had written about their coldness, about the way they'd treated me like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome, about how every Christmas they made it clear Asher wasn't enough, not polished enough, not loud enough, not the kind of child they could display. He wrote about the forced politeness, the way Vivian corrected me in front of others, and how Harris always changed the subject when Ethan tried to talk about our son's accomplishments. He ended it with a line that made my breath catch. "If you can't love the people I love, then maybe you don't really love me at all." I looked up. "When did you write this? 3 years ago," he said quietly, "but I never sent it. I thought maybe they'd come around." And now, he opened the second envelope, the one he'd pulled out earlier, and showed me the trust fund documents. Legal notarized, comprehensive, started the day Asher was born, he said. Every month, automatic deposits, separate from their money, protected. I ran my hand across the paper, trying to absorb it. Last year, he continued, Asher didn't cry at the party, but in the car on the way home, he wiped his face with his sleeve, said maybe he'd be enough next year. That's when Ethan knew, and that's when he began to plan his escape. By the time we returned to the dining room, dessert had been cleared, and brandy had appeared in crystal glasses. The mood had returned to something resembling merriment, but it was brittle, like the room was balanced on a chandelier thread that could snap at any moment. Harris stood and lifted his glass. To family, he began his voice smooth and practiced. To the next generation of Marwoods who carry our name, our values, and our future. He looked toward Emma first, then Tyler, then Lachlan. Each child earned a compliment, a nod, a mention of scholarships, recitals, test scores. Every grandchild was accounted for except mine. I watched Asher glance up from his seat, his small brow furrowed. He wasn't expecting praise. He never did. But it still landed like a stone dropped quietly into water, spreading ripples no one could admit they saw. And Harris added with a smile that barely twitched his mouth. We've decided to open the Aspen House for New Year's family only. Grace Andrew makes sure the kids bring their skis. No one looked at us. No one had to. Asher blinked once and reached for his water glass. Ethan stood. Again. He didn't raise his voice, but the table fell quiet. He stepped behind Asher's chair, resting a hand gently on our son's shoulder. I want to clarify something he said. Since we're talking about family and about legacy, Harris raised an eyebrow. Vivian's grip on her glass tightened just enough to make it clink. I've formally transferred ownership of the Addison Hollow estate to Asher, Ethan said. It's no longer part of the Marwood Trust. It belongs to him completely. Gasps weren't audible, but I felt them. A flicker of movement from Grace, a shift in posture from Andrew. Silence from Harris. Vivian recovered first. But the Vermont home is part of the long-term asset ledger. Your grandfather. My grandfather left it to me, Ethan replied calmly. And now, it's his great-grandson's. I've made sure no board, no trust, no last-minute revision can change that. Harris set his glass down deliberately. Then he smiled. Thin. Cold. Calculating. The tension in the room was no longer something you could pretend away. It had weight, now thick and undeniable. Harris leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed, hands clasped in front of him like a man preparing to negotiate a hostile takeover. But Ethan didn't budge. Vivian's voice trembled slightly when she spoke. That property was always meant to stay within the family structure, Ethan. You know that. It has, he said simply, just not the version of family you're trying to preserve. She blinked, and for the first time in all the years I'd known her, she didn't seem to have a line prepared. Harris cleared his throat. You've made a mistake. One you'll regret when you understand what's at stake. I can revise the trust, remove your name, cut your access. We control more than just property, Ethan. Ethan tilted his head, slightly calm as ever. No, you don't. Not anymore. He reached into his inside coat pocket and unfolded a copy of something thick, yellowed legal paper, stamped, signed, notarized. He laid it flat on the table like a chess move. This is from grandfather's will. The full version, not the one you condensed for family records. Section 14, quiet clause, rarely referenced. It states that all direct descendants of his grandchildren are entitled to equal legacy shares. That includes Asher. Vivian gasped. Harris's jaw clenched. I had it reviewed independently, Ethan continued. I've already filed the enforcement with a private attorney. You can't undo it without a court challenge, and trust me, the optics won't look good if you try to strip your grandson's inheritance because he doesn't fit your mold. I watched Harris's mouth open, then close. His silence said everything. Ethan looked at Asher, then at me. I protected him before you ever knew you could hurt him. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Vivian looked down at her lap, her voice low and uncertain. You did all of this? Behind our backs. No, Ethan said. I did it quietly, because I knew one day I'd have to do it publicly. And now, here we were. I leaned closer to Ethan and whispered, it's time. He nodded without hesitation, as if he'd been waiting for me to say it. We turned to Asher, still sitting so quietly, the envelope resting on his lap like a shield. I crouched beside him and brushed his hair back from his forehead. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "we're going to leave now. But it's your choice. Do you want to keep your drawing or give it to her anyway?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor as if he were deciding something bigger than any child should have to. Then he stood slowly, his small hand still clutching the rolled painting I had rescued earlier. Ethan and I stayed back as Asher walked alone toward Vivian. She was still seated, glass forgotten on the table, posture stiff as if she didn't know how to breathe anymore. Asher held the painting out to her with both hands. "I made this for you," he said quietly. "It's the garden you used to sit in. I thought you might like to remember it." Vivian reached out as if on instinct, her fingers grazing the paper. But before she could speak, Asher added, "It's the last one I'll ever make for you." She blinked. No words came. Her throat moved like she might try, but nothing followed, and then Asher turned and walked back to us. We gathered our coats without ceremony, without anyone rising to stop us. Behind us, the room was quiet. Not just stunned, cracked. I could feel the fractures spreading through it like hairline lines and old porcelain. Something had broken, and no one knew yet whether to glue it back or let it fall. As we crossed the foyer, Harris remained frozen in his chair. Vivian looked down at her hands like they didn't belong to her. We stepped outside into the biting air, into something cleaner. I took Asher's hand in mine and didn't look back. Not until the heavy door latched behind us with a final, satisfying click. Inside the car, Ethan exhaled and started the engine. The snow fell in soft, steady flakes as we pulled into the long, gravel driveway. The Vermont house wasn't grand, not by Marwood standards, but it had something those cold mansions never did soul. The red-painted porch stood out like a promise, and the moment we stepped onto it, I felt something in my chest loosen. We moved in with just what we needed. A few boxes, Asher's books, my baking tins, Ethan's tools, no silver platters, no name cards, no fragile family portraits to hang with obligation, just warmth, just space. Asher claimed the sunroom for his art. Ethan spent an entire afternoon setting up the table by the window, anchoring it so it wouldn't wobble, arranging shelves for paint jars and sketchbooks. Asher didn't say much, but I saw it in his shoulders, the way they dropped with relief. The house had its creaks, its quirks, floorboards that sang when you stepped just right, radiators that hissed like old cats. But it welcomed us. Every imperfect inch of it wrapped around us like a second chance. One night, as I unpacked the last box of kitchen dishes, I found Ethan in the doorway leaning against the frame with a cup of tea in hand. "I thought I married someone quiet," I said, smiling. "I was," he replied, returning the smile. "But you don't stay quiet when your son's dignity is on the line." I crossed the room and wrapped my arms around him. He rested his chin on my shoulder, and we stood like that for a long time, just breathing. Later that evening, we framed Asher's painting, the one he never wanted to leave behind, and hung it above the fireplace. The colors glowed against the rustic wood, soft and full of life, his first brushstroke in this new chapter. I didn't miss the grandeur, the chandeliers, or the antique china. I didn't miss the measured smiles or icy handshakes. What we had now felt honest, ours. Ethan kissed the top of my head and whispered, "This house will know real joy." And the next morning, that promise began to take shape. Christmas morning arrived quietly the way it should. No staff scurrying down hallways, no orchestrated drama or designer garlands. Just the scent of cinnamon rolls baking and the muffled sound of snow falling outside the windows. Asher was already awake when we came downstairs. He sat cross-legged by the fireplace, his single handmade stocking hanging nearby. We hadn't filled it with anything flashy, just things we knew he'd truly love. A new set of watercolor brushes, a small stack of classic books, a compass Ethan had carved into a walnut casing, its lid engraved with Asher's initials. He pulled each item out slowly with careful wonder. No frenzy, no grabbing, just appreciation. When he found the compass, his face lit up. "I'll use it when we go hiking," he said, turning it over in his hands. "So we don't get lost." Ethan smiled. "You're already ahead of us." After breakfast, we bundled up and walked the edge of the property. The snow came up to Asher's knees, but he trudged through it with a smile so wide I felt something in me heal. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't shrink beside his cousins. He belonged. When we came back in, the fire was still going. I tucked his stocking into a keepsake box, and we all sat on the rug in front of the hearth. Asher handed me a drawing he'd made that morning, a sketch of the house with the red porch snow falling all around it. 3 stick figures at the front door holding hands. I framed it that afternoon and hung it right above the mantel next to the first painting we brought with us from Connecticut. This one was different. It didn't try to impress anyone. It didn't ask to be loved. It simply said, "This is home." Later that day, a postcard arrived in the mail edges curled from cold. It was from Andrew. "You were right to leave. I'm working on my own exit." I read it aloud to Ethan and smiled. The fire crackled beside us, and Asher leaned against my arm, humming under his breath.